interface. Is that one working? That one's not working either. Yes, it is. There it is. Okay, we'll have this one instead. So we're going on a bit of a journey today. We're going to kick off with some seeds being planted by some opening keynote addresses, then through various activities in the course of the day, hopefully finishing up with those seeds germinating into some good ideas at the end of the afternoon that indeed might turn into some kind of practical projects. And I guess with the analogy of seeds and germination, I'm instantly getting into the idea of growth. But we're not talking so much about organic growth today, but more about economic growth and the extent to which our present system might wish to be challenged with some viable alternatives. And the reasons for that, I'm sure for those of you who are environmentally minded in particular, never mind looking at the social consequences of the way we presently do growth, are all too clear. My particular perspective on this topic comes from many years serving as an environmental campaigner and looking at the ways in which many of our environmental problems are ultimately traced back to economic choices. And indeed, I challenge anyone to really think about an environmental problem that in the end doesn't have some kind of economic root in terms of seeking to achieve a particular outcome in the name of economic development and in the name of people's well-being, but which causes large-scale environmental damage. The idea of economic growth, it's not been there forever, and I think it's just worth remembering that actually this is an idea of the mid-20th century that came from economists back then, trying to find some proxy for the way in which we measured progress. And they came up with the idea of gross domestic product, and that was taken as one way in which we could measure the advancement of societies. And the people who invented that basic idea of GDP, they did say this shouldn't be taken as an overall measure of well-being, it shouldn't be taken as an overall benchmark of progress. But of course the politicians like to have simple things that they can measure and which they can show back to the electorate. And so the idea of GDP, and more importantly of growing GDP as a way of improving the welfare of people, became embedded in our political narrative to the point where it is now the most dominant aspect of political discourse in this country and indeed across the world. In the depths of the current financial crisis, of course, we can see it more vividly than ever before as countries are trying to repay debt. And the only way they've got to repay debt is by growing their economies. We've got ourselves into rather a difficult trap, it would seem. But why is the economic growth such a problem for the environment? Well, one of the things, of course, is the extent to which this is measuring an increase in transactions in goods and services moving through particular economies. And most goods and services, in the end, rely on energy and natural resources to sustain them. Not all of them, but many of them do. And if one looks at the emissions of greenhouse gases, for example, as one proxy of how economic growth relates back to the environment, in pretty much all countries across history, you can see a rising demand for energy, and most of that energy being based on fossil fuels, leading to increased impacts on the global climate system as we try to increase the size of economies. And of course, we're beginning to realise that the impact on the environment that's coming from this kind of activity is beginning to feed back into economics as well. There's plenty of studies out there which tell us about this. The most recent on the climate change side was the Stern Review in 2006, which set out some numbers estimating how the impact on GDP growth from not abating climate change gas emissions could in the next 30 odd years be about 20% of GDP. So you've got the ultimate paradox there of countries trying to grow their economies in terms of their GDP in a way which is allegedly improving human welfare, but in a way which ultimately might lead to economic contraction because of the costs of the damage leading to impacts on infrastructure and people because of environmental decline. And this paradox, I think, is based upon one of the largest misconceptions, economic misconceptions in history, and it sometimes helps to draw a parallel, I think, between the idea of financial capital and natural capital. And financial capital, we know that if you invest money and you have some profit-making enterprise that can generate a return, you get paid a dividend. You have stocks on the one hand, your capital, and on the other you have flows of dividends that come back. It's how our economic system presently works. When it comes to nature, however, we have a complete misconception, because instead of seeing our natural capital, our soils, water, and stable climate as a series of stocks, we regard them as a number of flows, and we're basically liquidating those stocks to create dividends which aren't dividends at all. We're liquidating the natural capital in order to sustain economic growth of the kind that we presently measure and celebrate when we grow it. So what's the scale of this in crude economic terms? Because some people may argue, well, you know, the decline of the environment actually, and this is George Osborne's narrative, is that it's necessary to enable the economy to grow with some environmental costs in the short term, because ultimately that's going to be the way in which we're going to improve conditions for people now and into the future. And it's surprising how few studies there are actually that seek to quantify the scale of this impact on natural systems arising from the way in which we presently do economics. But there's one study which I think is particularly illustrative, and it comes from a group of researchers led by a man called Robert Costanza working in Stanford University during the 1990s. And if you go to Google and put Costanza, nature and economics into a search engine, you will find the seminal paper published in Nature in 1998, which began to put some numbers on this kind of conversation I'm relating now. And basically what Costanza and his colleagues tried to do was to work out what it would cost humankind to replace the services being provided for free by nature, should they be somehow withdrawn. And of course we can't possibly do this, but he tried to put some numbers on how much it would cost humans in terms of labour and technology to replace essential services being provided presently by nature, which of course are being degraded by the way in which we're presently doing economics. And so they looked at, for example, the protection of low-lying areas from flood risk by the work of forests, mangroves and coral reefs. They looked at the numberless microbes working in the world's soils which improve fertility and enable agriculture to continue year after year. They looked at freshwater replenishment and the way in which aquifers are recharged by rainfall. They looked at disease control and pest control and the extent to which birds, for example, enable agricultural productivity to go up by controlling certain insect pests. They looked at the question of carbon storage and the fact that forests across the world at the moment, would you believe, are sucking up about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide emissions coming from fossil fuels as we cut them down and count that as economic growth. And he looked at the question of pollination and the extent to which 1/3 of our food is dependent on small insects in particular to enable plant sex to take place in order to enable the reproductive cycle that we then eat in the form of fruit and vegetables and so on. And so he tried to calculate the value of all of that and several other services in order to put an economic number on it. And he did. He said that the value of all of those services every year, so from this time last year to this time this year, the value in 1998 money was about $35 trillion per year. This is his initial calculation. And it's interesting to note that GDP in that year, when he estimated that 35 trillion figure being the value of nature, and that's the low end, it went up to 50 depending on how you put the assumptions in. In that year, the size of the economy, which we measure, which we grow, was $18 trillion. So Costanza's conclusion was simply put that the value of the bit of the economy we don't measure, i.e. nature, is about twice as big as the bit we do measure, GDP, and as we seek to grow GDP, we're degrading the free services provided by nature. And I thought this was a really quite an important point for the world to know about, and I think remains one of the seminal studies in that space. There was a piece of work recently called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which took on some of Costanza's kind of thinking, effectively a stocktake of nature published in the early part of 2005. And this study set out to look at the world's ecosystems, so all the things I've just described, but a chunk up in terms of big biomes like rainforests and the rangelands and the polar ice caps and what have you. And that assessment, looking at the state of nature and the extent to which it was in decline, took Costanza's analysis a step further, I felt, in concluding that if we don't arrest this general decline in the quality of the natural environment, it would not be possible to meet the Millennium Development Goals on poverty reduction. And I thought that was really quite a profound conclusion to come from a bunch of ecological scientists who were basically juxtaposing the decline of nature against our ability to continue with the growth which we're using to reduce poverty at the global level. So there's a lot of material out there which is telling us that actually we are on a pretty disastrous short-term course if we continue to grow economies at the global level, as we have done in the West over the last half century or so, and apply our model to the emerging economies in the Asian and Latin American region. Because if you go from 1.8 billion people consuming like we are now, up to 9 billion people by mid-century consuming like we are now, simply put, it does not fit. There is not a scientist on Earth who I would say has shown a convincing model whereby present consumption patterns can be applied to 4 times as many people consuming like Westerners in a way which is going to be compatible with soil health, fresh water supply, climate stability and the conservation of biodiversity, just for starters. So we do have quite a problem on our hands, I think it's fair to say. So the response of this by the mainstream economists has often been one of how do we decouple? So how do we continue to grow, because growth is good, we've discovered, because we've managed to have 2 cars each and 4 televisions and everything else. How do we continue with this process at the same time as decoupling from the environmental damage? That's where a lot of the mainstream economists have taken their thinking, because they like the idea of growth so much they can't drop the idea, so instead they look at ways in which they can start to remove it from the environmental consequences which are now so adequately documented. Now, the question then comes, so if we are going to go on this journey of continued growth so that Africans, Latin Americans, Asians and everybody else in the world can live like Westerners do in Europe and North America, what level of decoupling do we actually need in order to achieve this? Again, there is some work done on this which I think is rather good, and I think the piece which I would point to is Tim Jackson's work in Prosperity Without Growth, where he tries to put some numbers on the extent to which we need to change the impacts of economic development. And again, I'll just paraphrase very briefly to give you a flavour of what he said. So what Jackson did was to take our present understanding of climate science, which is the need to cut by about 80% by 2050 minimum, to stay within 2 degrees, and starting that pretty much immediately. And then he put on top of that scientific estimate some assumptions that are there in politics everywhere you look. So, first of all, to continue with the process of economic growth, and he put a modest number of 2% a year between now and 2050. He said that there's also an assumption in his model to look at the consumption patterns of everybody living like us by the middle of the century, so 9 billion people living like Europeans. And he said that there would be 9 billion. So these assumptions alongside the climate reduction target, more people, more growth, more consumption, on those kinds of numbers. And so he concluded, and he based this on the amount of carbon emitted at the moment to create $1 of wealth, which is 700 grams per dollar. So if you can imagine this, the world's economy churning away with goods and services being produced and exchanged. Each dollar of additional wealth that's contributing to GDP, presently it's about 700 grams of carbon to produce that on the global average. If we wish to meet all those assumptions and to be able to stay within inside a 2-degree climate pathway, then we need to get down to 6 grams of carbon per dollar of wealth created. So that's more than a 99% cut. And you don't often hear the climate change challenge being put in that way, because people generally don't put in the effect of economic growth when they're talking about 80% cuts. So we've got to go much further and much deeper if we're going to be able to achieve on that particular agenda. And that's just one property. There's plenty of others to do with soil, biodiversity, land use, natural resources and everything else. So we've got a big job on our hands. So we know that the economic system right now is leading to an ecological catastrophe, and I use that term advisedly based upon what I've seen from the conservation biologists in particular. We know that it's being driven with huge momentum, not least because of the present financial crisis, and we know that it's going to be very challenging to maintain that system through an approach based upon decoupling of one from the other. So why is it so difficult to get this on the agenda in a way where we can actually see some kind of political progress? And I've spent quite a lot of time trying to do this in different ways over the years, and I'll give you a few headings that I think are part of the problem. So the first is that we've got used to it. In Western countries, we get a lot of comfort out of continuing economic growth. We've had jobs, we've had rising living standards, and of course we've had a political narrative which has been self-reinforcing. Can you imagine anybody, apart from our dear leader, Caroline Lucas, going to the electorate and saying we need something different to this particular system? All of them are lined up behind the idea of promising more economic growth. And they do it in different ways, whether it's more cuts or less cuts, or more investment or more liberalisation. The basic narrative that lies behind all of the different political ideas is that they're going to deliver growth. So it's embedded there because it's assumed that the public want it. And we've of course lived in this period of ever rising expectations. If you look at the period in the 1950s when rationing was coming to an end, and the progress in the sense of material well-being and consumption in this country, it's gone ever upwards. And the only way it's gone ever upwards is because of the economic growth which the politicians have been able to deliver through different policy choices. And now, as I said earlier on, we now have the additional driver of debt. The only way that Greece is going to get out of the hole that it's in, according to the Germans and the British and everybody else around who's commentating on this, is by growing its economy. They've got to slash their expenditure, but the only way they're going to be able to pay the debts they're being incurred now is by growing their economy at some point in the future. How are they going to do that? Irrespective of how, this has just simply reinforced the drivers that were already there in terms of the popular narrative for the politicians, the expectations of the public now being driven by debt as well. And I think actually one thing, and this is perhaps the agenda for us here today, the big thing that's not enabled us to cut through and to begin opening up a new conversation is the absence of a coherent alternative. What is the coherent alternative to the economic growth being offered by David Cameron, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg and the rest of them? What is the way in which we can start to talk about this? And I don't think, in the end, this is really about technical economics. I think this is much more about the battle of ideas in the sense of what makes common sense to people. Because if you look at what lies behind the present consent, behind the idea of free market economic growth, it's not really technical economics, because as soon as you start putting the ecological science into that, it does not work. But it's backed up because people have bought into an idea that's been put to them over a period of years with simple sound bites about the connections between markets, liberalisation, growth, well-being, poverty reduction, and the way in which we see the march of progress. What is the counter-narrative that comes from people who understand this kind of analysis I'm relating now? How do we develop that counter-narrative, and then how do we put it into the mainstream? And I think if you trace back the world we're living in now, it was a few people back in the 1930s who created the ideas that now are so dominant. And I think if we're going to prevail in the future, then we need to start embedding different ideas. And not only from the specialists, but from the grassroots and from the outcomes of meetings like this. So that's my Tuppeny worth by way of opening. Now my great pleasure to invite Rupert Reed, who's a philosopher, an academic, and regional coordinator for the Green Party in East Anglia, to share a few thoughts with us. And then we'll have one more speaker, and then we're going to break the tea, and then we're going to get into some conversation. Rupert, the floor is yours.